So you can see on the screen, this is probably a very important turning point in our time, the session that we're going to be having here now. We've touched on this a bit, but we're going to go into it in greater detail. So the thesis, in order for the priesthood of all believers to become a reality, we need to shift from a dependency to an equipping model of ministry. To translate that into the language we've been using, in order for people to become fully devoted followers of Christ or reproducing disciple makers, the church needs to intentionally shift from a model of ministry from dependency one to one that empowers the whole people of God for ministry. So this is a very fundamental look at the role of pastor vis-a-vis the people of God, the interlocking expectations that we have under what I would call the dependency model versus the equipping model. And so we're going to drill into this in some detail. There's a corny story told of the pastor who liked to leave his office every afternoon about 4 o'clock to go down to the local railroad tracks to watch the 420 train roll down and roll by. And somebody asked the pastor, why did you go to watch the train roll down the tracks at 4:20 in the afternoon? And his response was, I just like to see something moving under its own steam. And, sometimes you feel like you're just pulling the church along. Am I going to have to keep dragging this along? To use an American image in terms of a sports event, but I'll translate that. How many players are there on a soccer team or on a worldwide football team? 11, just like American football. Okay, so this works out pretty well. Somebody has compared the church to a soccer match. There's 50,000 people in the stands in desperate need of exercise, watching 22 people on the field in desperate need of rest, all right? So we got a lot of spectators in our churches and watching a few people doing all the work. And so that's kind of an image of what is happening in many of our church settings. The book that I've written that contains a lot of this, which has not been a part of your material here, is called Unfinished Business, Returning the Ministry to the People of God. And the theme of the book, this is my first book that I wrote back in 1990. The theme of the book was that we are living at the time when the Reformation will finally be completed. It was my first book. When you write your first book, you make these rather audacious statements. So the idea was that one of the key elements of the Reformation in the 1500s was the priesthood of all believers, that all of God's people would be ministers. We got the Bible back into the hands of the people. Martin Luther translates the Bible into the vernacular German so that people can have access to it, rather than just the priests who speak Latin and putting on Latin masses. And so the promise was that the ministry would be returned to the people of God. Well, what happened was that the Protestant church adopted as much of a clerical view of ministry as the Roman Catholic Church had. Pastors ended up dominating the church just as priests dominated the church within the Roman Catholic tradition. And so my sense was we're now living at the time of the promise of the Reformation that would be finally fulfilled. Not only the Bible in the hands of the people, but the ministry in the hands of the people. And so I lived off of that theme for quite some time. I have morphed into a belief that there's an underlying issue there that people cannot become ministers until they learn what it is to become a disciple. So there's a more fundamental issue there that we need to work off. But let's work on this particular theme. So the idea that we've been trapped in the dependency model ministry. Let's do a little bit of reality check here. So looking at at least the ministry situation I'm aware of in the United States, here are some of the things that tend to be true. The 80-20 rule tends to be in place. 20% of the people do 80% of the work. 20% of the people give 80% of the money. So it's usually a small group of invested people who are carrying the ministry, and the rest come as sort of partakers of, spectators of the work that other people have done. Does that sound like something that may be true in your situations as well? That unfortunately it's not spread out evenly among all the people. Ministry is for those who go into the ministry. We need to listen to ourselves talk. Who gets a call from God? Pastors? Missionaries? Seminary professors? There was an ad that I saw in one Christian magazine. It was an ad for a seminary. And here's how the ad read. When you get the call us. So who in their minds gets a call? People who go to seminary to become pastors. So call is restricted to a few. We talk about being called into the ministry. If there's only a few of us who are called into the ministry, what's left for everybody else? Well, it's kind of secondary ministry, right? Ministry to help the pastors do their ministry. That's the mindset that is very much in place in many church contexts. That the middle ministry is done by the pastors. We're here just to be assistants because the pastors can't do it all. If they could do it all, we'd let them do it all. But since they can't, we need to be here to assist them in that. So I oftentimes say that there are actually not two genders, but there are three genders. Did you know that? There are men, women, and pastors. That's the third gender. And so we have this kind of set-apart kind of mentality. The average person does not know their spiritual gifts in context of call. So if we did an interview of people in our churches and walked up to them and said, can you name your spiritual gifts and where you're supposed to use those gifts? How many people would be able to give you an instant answer? I've got the gift of teaching. I'm supposed to be talking about discipleship. That kind of thing. So we probably say a fairly small percentage of those people. And ministry is often viewed as separate from the workplace. When we think of ministry, we think of sort of sacred space. But do people think of their ministry as in the workplace? That I minister in the workplace. And we have this separate category, the sacred, secular kinds of distinctions that has taken place. Martin Luther, when he, rediscovered the priesthood of all believers and justification by faith alone, laid the foundation for the collapsing of the sacred and the secular. That there's two separate spaces. And he said, no, there's not two separate spaces. Basically, everything is sacred. So whether you are a farmer or a contractor or a school administrator, that's for a Christian, that's all sacred work and a part of one's call. So somebody who was an elementary school principal like my wife was is as much called of God as I am. It's not just because you go into the church that you receive a call. And so we're trying to expand out this whole issue. So my thesis is that we have this dependency model ministry. So I'm going to have us look at Exodus chapter 18 as a case study to help us understand the contrast between a dependency model ministry and an equipping model of ministry. Exodus 18, starting at verse 13. But let me set up the background to this as well. So, as you know, the Exodus has taken place. Moses has led the people of God out of Egypt across the Red Sea. And there's been this unrelenting crisis that the people of God have been in. They're out in the wilderness. They're lacking food. They complain to God, and God sends them the manna and the quail. And they're feeling better for a while. Then they're out of water. Moses, did you lead us out into the wilderness simply to have us both starve to death or, be without anything to drink? And so they're murmuring against Moses, right? And then they have this battle with the Amalekites in Exodus chapter 17. And finally, when you get to Exodus 18, there's a bit of a respite. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, comes to Moses with Moses' wife and two children. And he shows up and hears from Moses all that God has done for the people. And they have a time of sacrifice and praise and thanksgiving for that. And then it says in verse 13 of Exodus 18, the next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and laws." Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representatives before God and bring their disputes to Him. Teach them the decrees and laws, and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, and have them bring their difficult cases to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves, that they will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, and you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." Okay, so let's take a look at the issue here. What is Jethro's implied criticism of Moses when he says to Moses, "Why do you sit alone?" Jethro is watching. Moses has gone into his tent. He's set up his shingle. Court is in session. You all line up in front of my tent with all of your problems and all your complaints, and I'll decide them one at a time. Why do you sit alone? What's the criticism there? What's implied?
He didn't multiply himself.
Multiply yourself. He didn't multiply himself. Moses has a view of himself that he is the only one who can solve their problems, right? I'm the judge. God has set me up in that role. I will handle them one at a time. That's why I'm going to sit alone here and judge this. Why do you sit alone? What are you doing for your people? While all these people stand around you from morning till evening. You're going to wear yourself out. You're going to wear the people out. This is not a good thing. So if I were to transfer this over into what I see happening in the church, I see Moses, before he gets his correction and change, as a symptom of the problem that we have in the church today as well. Pastors do the ministry to and for God's people while the people are grateful, oftentimes not so grateful, recipients of their professional care. Pastors become the centerpiece. They become the ones who clog things up, and everything kind of gets stopped with them. And so here's some images I use to describe the dependency model ministry. First of all, there is the caretaker role in the dependency model ministry. The pastor cares for, and the people receive the care. The pastor is the primary caregiver in the life of a church. And this is oftentimes true in many of our situations and settings. If something goes south in the life of one of our parishioners. It could be an illness, it could be a death in the family, it could be a critical counseling need, a child that has gone off the rails, a divorce that people are going through. People go to the pastor to solve the problem, right? Because the pastor is the caregiver. And I say oftentimes there is this emotional contract between pastor and people. It goes like this. Pastor, if something goes wrong in my life and you do not show up to address this concern, then you are not being a very good pastor. And you are letting me down in terms of what the critical role is that you have for me to play. Does that sound like you can relate to that in some of your churches? Yeah, okay, this is not too far off base. Another image for this is the medical model. The medical model is we send our doctors off to medical school or to be trained, and we go to a doctor for what? We go to a doctor to describe our symptoms, and we expect the doctor to prescribe something for us to do, and then we do it. And oftentimes, I think this is the way we view pastors. You know, pastors are kind of our spiritual answer persons. We go to a pastor, we expect them to be able to diagnose our problem and give us a solution to that problem on a spiritual level. So we have kind of a medical model in relationship to pastoral work as well. But the one that I think I relate to the most, and is probably the most disturbing, is what I would call that we have developed an unhealthy family system. And we have kept people in the church as perpetual children. So let me tell you a story that I think captures some of this in terms of the unhealthy family system. In the summer of 1972, many years ago, my wife and I led a deputation team, a summer mission team, to Mississippi, which is a southern state here in our country. And we had 6 of us. We drove this cabin kind of van down to Mississippi. And we had a young lady on our team by the name of Joanne. Joanne was immediately recognizable because she was immensely obese. She probably weighed, I'm guessing, 350 pounds. It's a lot of weight. And in fact, she always created quite a stir because of her size wherever we went. And we spent 8 weeks together that summer. And we had a chance to hear her story as to why she was as obese as she was. She said growing up in her home, her mother and father did not get along very well. And the mother became emotionally attached to her as the daughter. And as she was going through her elementary school years and junior high years, her mother used to pack her lunch for her. And she would put in her lunch 7 or 8 sandwiches for her to eat. And she, was intensely overfed by her mother, intentionally. And we asked her, well, why? What do you think was going on there? Why would she want you to be so overweight? And her thought behind this was, that she was finally getting to understand this, was that her mother was so afraid that she would leave the home and leave her alone with her father, that the way to keep her at home was to make sure that she was not attractive to other men. Now, you would look at that and you would say, wow, that is sick. That is a very unhealthy system. Now let me make the connection to the church. What if we created a system where the pastors were the ones that could only do the feeding, only provide for the people, and it created a system where the children could not grow up and leave the home. And the intention wasn't so that the people would actually grow up and become responsible for themselves. I would say that's a pretty sick system. I think we have created a sick system. That we have created a model of ministry that doesn't allow the people to grow up become reliant upon the pastors. The pastor's the one that feeds us. We become perpetual children because we need to be taken care of. Is that what's happened in our churches? Our model of ministry? You can push back on me if you think that's an overstatement, if that's too harsh. That's the stark terms that I think has happened in many of our churches. So I'll let that settle in. That was a pretty rough kind of statement. So how are we fostering dependency? What expectations did Moses have for himself? So when we read our text, verse 15, in response to Jethro's question, why do you sit alone while all the people stand around you from morning till evening? How did Moses answer that? Well, because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and laws. What expectation did Moses have of his own role? What expectation did he have of himself? Well, his expectations were potentially, and I'll translate this now into the context of the church, that pastors think that they have to be omnicompetent. We've used that term already, right? That the pastor that wrote me the letter said he wanted to become the omnicompetent pastor. And that means that you have to be good at everything. If the expectation is that you are going to cover all these different roles, then the pressure you put upon yourself is to become good at everything, to cover all the bases. You need to be an excellent preacher, a crackerjack administrator, a tender-hearted counselor, love fundraising, be a great pastoral showpiece at social functions, and it must feel like we're being, torn apart from all different directions. So there's this sense of, I got to go off and I got to take a class on premarital counseling. I got to be good at that. Got to get a business degree so I can run the church. Got to learn how to do budgets and financing, because it all kind of comes back on us. We have to do it all. Secondly, we must remain in control, or the opposite of control is there is a sense of distrust. Robert Munger, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote My Heart Christ Home, was my seminary professor who was that one who showed me his humility. He said, in our time, it may be the single greatest bottleneck to the renewal and outreach of the church is the division of roles between clergy and laity that results in the hesitancy of the clergy to trust the laity with significant responsibility, and in turn, a reluctance on the part of the laity to trust themselves as authentic ministers of Christ, either in the church or outside of the church. So, oftentimes, one side of pastors is there's a strong sense of control. I've got to be in charge of everything. I can't let people just kind of run wild. I'm the bottleneck. I'm the one that's is at the center of all things. I've lived with a couple of pastors who functioned in that way. My very first ministry position out of seminary, moved from Southern California to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was associate pastor in a church there right in the middle of the University of Pittsburgh. I did university ministry. And unfortunately, the senior pastor and I had some trouble with each other. I was trained in an empowering model of ministry where you're to equip people, set them free, let them pursue their own ministries. He was trained in a control model of ministry. He did not allow a committee to meet in the church unless he was present. Nobody meets unless I'm there. Well, why would you do that? Control. I want to make sure what's happening there is consistent with what I desire for the church, and things do not get out of control in that way. He described to me the fact that when he was trained in seminary, the model of ministry of a pastor was you kept your distance from the congregation. You did not have friends in your congregation. Distance created a sense of authority. I am distant, I'm removed, I have authority over you. Now, from those of you who are from Asian cultures, my guess is you just immediately recognize what I was describing. African also, okay. And anybody else who wants to jump into that, feel free, So, we live in the United States in a little bit more egalitarian culture, where people in a democratic society, but we still struggle with this issue as well, this bifurcation between clergy and laity, the clergy over the laity. It gets accentuated in certain other cultures, whether it's African culture, Asian cultures, because of the elevation of position. I know in some Asian cultures, where it's Korea, China, probably Vietnam, etc., there's been a strong history of Confucianism. And within Confucianism, there's the elevation of the emperor, the teacher, and the parent. And the teacher here, it would be pastor, in that setting. And you elevate those people, and you honor them, while at the same time trying to undermine them. Right? Am I right? I've watched it. I've taught enough in Korean settings and et cetera to know that there's this sense of we elevate you, but then we try to undercut you at the same time. So it's a very difficult kind of situation. So this issue of control and elevation that can be there, control the goings on within church. So on one hand, pastors get pedestalized, put up on a pedestal, honored in that way, and that can feel really good, because you're a special person. Yet at the same time, there's that sense of control that comes with that role as well, and sense of distance. So must remain in control or distrust. There is the sense that with the role of pastor, there's kind of a priestly aura that comes with that role. I always remember this story of my first pastorate. We as pastors who were leading in worship wore black robes. So before worship, I was wearing my black robe, and I was standing out in the hallway of the church, and I was having a conversation with a young mother in the church. And this young mother had a young daughter, probably 3 or 4 years old, wrapped around her leg the entire time we were conversing. And I glanced down every once in a while. I saw this young daughter looking up at me with kind of a quizzical look on her face. And finally, in the midst of this conversation, the young daughter points to me and looks up at her mother and says, "Is that God?" And I don't know what was going on in her, mind exactly. But that is really a tough role to give up, Once you become God in somebody's mind, well. But, this kind of priestly aura that only the pastors can do certain things, and the honoring that comes with that particular role, it can really feed into our ego. And this leads to the last element here, the unhealthy need to be needed. And that can become a very unhealthy need. When people say things to us like, "Pastor, you were there just at that time in my life when I needed you the most in that very difficult circumstance. I don't know how I could have possibly gotten through that without you." Boy, does that ever feed something in us? That we become a redemptive figure at that moment. We become the savior in somebody's life. And then we want to hear that again, and again, and again. And then after somebody walks out of worship on a Sunday morning and says to you, "Pastor, that was the best sermon I've ever heard on that topic. Man, I'm going to work harder next week," to get that same kind of comment. And it's very easy to have that feed into our system. So I wonder sometimes if there's a psychological profile that goes along with pastor. It says as we go into this thing, because we have a desire to be elevated and have people say nice things about us, and feeds us into us. All of us want to have people say nice things about us, right? You don't want to be living with criticism all the time. Well, there's a case study in your notes. And it's on, on page 20, I believe. And it has to do with a note that I received. And so let's discuss this case study. I'll put it up on the screen. This is a real note. I didn't write this one myself and sign somebody else's name to it. This was something I got. Now, to sort of set this up a little bit, I can tell you even the date that this happened, probably somewhere in around May of 1993. I had been serving this church that I was at for about 5 years. I had been working strongly to change the model of ministry from a pastoral care ministry to a ministry of care. I was very self-conscious about the fact that we had the expectation that the senior pastor or the pastors would be the one who delivered care in the congregation. And so I banned the phrase pastoral care. You cannot use that phrase in this church. We will have a ministry of care, and we will have the people of God trained to do the ministry of care, but it's not just the pastors who are going to deliver care. So we tried to change that model of ministry. But I had become close to this couple. Anna and Al had signed this letter, and I was just about ready to go on sabbatical. She talks about it as vacation here in the note. And I was going to be going away for 3 months, and so I wanted to get by and see Al in the hospital, and I had heard that he had had a tough time. And Al spoke to me when I was in the hospital, it says here, about an emotional and spiritual encounter with the Lord that he had received, and so I had a really wonderful visit with him. And then I got this note from Anna, even though it said Anna and Al. It's a very short note. But there's a lot in it that can hook you. That can be that barb that gets in under your skin. Dear Greg, busy as you were. Oh, we're busy pastors. And I bet you we let people know that, how busy we are. You came to visit Al. We consider this a great blessing. Because they knew that I didn't do a lot of hospital calling. Yes, many saints visited too, but your visit meant the most. Woo! Prayers were answered through the nurses, doctors, and you. You probably could have put you in all capital letters, which I think I did in the note over here. Al is doing well. Enjoy your well-earned vacation. It's now well-earned because you came to visit us with our love. Now, I know I'm making fun of this note, and it's not very fair. It was obviously a sincere note that was sent to me and with great appreciation. And so I've got a little bit of sarcasm in here in terms of this note. But there's also some embedded messages here in the note. So let's take a look at that. What view of pastor does Anna seem to have, according to this note? Huh? A saint? Yeah, saint? Yeah. Yes. Many saints visited, but you are a real saint, Yeah. You are the saint. So there's an elevation there in terms of what the presence of Christ that the pastor brings. Does the pastor bring a greater presence of Christ than other people? Probably in her mind, yes. The saints were there. That's appreciated. But, when the holy man comes, more. What message might I be inclined to take from this message, from this note? What could I take it in? I am important. Okay. You better keep it up. Yeah. Got you on a string. Keep going. Would I like to get more of these notes? These are nice notes to get, aren't they? Yeah. What unhealthy attitudes might be reinforced in these few words? Expectations, yeah. Okay. That need to be needed. Yes, okay. I think I'll up my hospital visitation, you know. That fills the ego, yes, absolutely. And how do we help people have expectations that ministry received from fellow gifted members is equal to ministry received from their pastor? Because I think that's the underlying message here. They received a lot of visits. But did they consider them visits that were people ministering in Christ's name? Or was that something just the pastor gave? We'll come back to that because I have another story to tell you about that. But so that's just to draw out this whole issue of the dependency model ministry. So pastoral expectations, we got to that. What are people's expectations of their pastor in the dependency model ministry? Moses is simply living out. Whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me. I decide between the parties, inform them of God's decrees. You know, and so what might be some of the justification and expectations? Well, Moses' justification is, I'm just doing what the people expect me to do. I'm just living out their expectations. So some of those expectations may be only the pastor can deliver real ministry. So only the pastor really, truly bears the presence of Christ. Jerry Cook, who's a pastor in British Columbia, tells the story of getting wind that Mrs. White and his congregation was rather upset with him. Through the grapevine, it came back to him that she had been in the hospital for 7 days, and she was sending the message around that the pastor never came. And she was pretty upset that the pastor never came. And so Pastor Cook decided to give her a call and hear out her concerns. But before he made the phone call, he decided to do a little research and find out how many people from the church had visited her while she was in the hospital. And he found out that she had visits from an average of 4 people a day for the 7 days that she was in the hospital. 28 visitors had come. Some of those maybe be repeat visitors, but they came. And so Pastor Cook gets on the phone and gives Mrs. White a phone call. Well, Mrs. White, how are you doing? Well, I'm fine now. Well, I understand you've been in the hospital. Well, it's a little late. Pastor Cook says, well, a little late for what? Well, I was in the hospital for 7 days and nobody came. Pastor Cook informed her kind of obliquely, well, I understand you actually had quite a number of visitors. But what was in her mind? If the pastor didn't come, I had not been visited. And what did she miss out on? 28 visits of representatives of Christ that were there for her. But since they were not the ones who could deliver real ministry, she didn't see it. It wasn't her ministry. We have anything like that in our churches? Yeah. Second thing in terms of Moses' justification for this role, or how we translate this in the church, is that pastors are closer to God than others. Ever been in a social function, pastors, and you have some food together, and you're getting your plate of food, and you're deciding where to sit in this fellowship. And then you take your food over a table, there's some people already sitting there, and you begin to sit down, and they say, the pastor's going to sit here. We're special. As if your priestly aura is now cast over that table, in that setting. So, or we ask people to pray for certain things as if our prayers have a more direct target to God than others. So you're stopped on a Sunday morning, Pastor, would you pray for such and such? And your prayers will matter more. There is a Dutch expression, I'm told, that when there's a convivial conversation going on among some people, and then all of a sudden there's this moment of awkward silence. And then the Dutch will break that awkward silence by saying, "Oh, a pastor walked by." Yeah, you got to watch what you say when a pastor's around, right? You better not play golf with a pastor, because they have to watch what you say when you play golf. So closer to God than the rest of us. And then finally here, we want a multi-talented pastor. We want that pastor who can do it all. In America, we have the temerity to actually hire mere mortals as pastors who can't do it all. And sometimes we get upset about that. So I've got a surefire solution for how to find the perfect pastor. It's in the form of a chain letter. Do you know what a chain letter is? A chain letter it's a letter you send to somebody, and then you're supposed to send that on to somebody else, and sends it on to somebody else. So instead of having a pastor search committee or however it is that you do within your particular denomination, you can use this chain letter. It goes like this. Dear church member, this chain letter is meant to bring happiness. Unlike other chain letters, it does not cost money. Simply send a copy of this letter to 6 other churches who are tired of their pastors. Then bundle up your pastor and send him to the church at the bottom of the list. In 1 week, you will receive 1,634 pastors. One of them should be a dandy. Have faith in this chain letter. One church broke the chain and got their old pastor back. So I'm sorry. I've been doing a lot of tongue-in-cheek here, and probably with a little more sarcasm than I should at this point in time, to make the point about we got to laugh at our own systems that we have set up and see what that's all about. So the last thing we'll say under the dependency model ministry here is what expectations do the people have of themselves? What roles do they play? Because it says here that the people are standing around waiting for Moses to render these decisions. And so what kind of, in a sense, passivity does this create when it comes to the people's role? If the pastor's the one at the center of all things and they're the ones who are doing the primary ministry, then what roles do the people play within a dependency model ministry? And oftentimes it's in the form of critics or spectators. There's kind of a sense of passivity. Is there oftentimes on a Sunday morning when I've done some preaching, like I was in my church in Chicago, I felt like that some Sundays I would look over at the choir, and immediately after the sermon, they would want to rate the sermon. They have cards on their laps. You've seen these with ice skating performances, and that was a 9.2. No, that was an 8.5. We set this system up. People walk out of church on Sunday morning, they greet us as pastors, and they have to say something to the effect of, "Oh, that was a good sermon, Pastor," or something like that, as if they have to give an instant review of the because they view themselves as spectators coming to evaluate the performance on that particular Sunday morning. I had one experience one Sunday when I'm at a church in Chicago. I'd been there for a few years. I was preaching that Sunday morning, and I didn't know how to handle this comment when a person came by. And the woman came by and said to me, shook hands and said to me, and I think she meant this as a positive comment. She said, "You're getting better." And I thought to myself, how am I supposed to handle that? I'm getting better than the lousy preacher I used to be. I think she meant that positively, but it was hard to exactly know. Secondly, the people of God are resistant to pastoral approaches. We sometimes set that up. Roberta Hesnes was my mentor for my doctor of ministry degree. I write about her in my book, Transforming Discipleship. She was on the faculty and staff at Fuller Seminary as well as on a church staff. And she told the story of inviting an elder from her church out to lunch. And they were having lunch together, having a wonderful conversation. They had been talking together for about 45 minutes at lunch, and she was just getting to know this elder and wanting to find out more about him. And all of a sudden, the elder stops and says, "Okay, what do you want?" And Roberta says, "What do you mean, what do I want?" And he says, "I've never been out to lunch with a pastor that didn't want something. Money, a job for me to do, something like that." And she said, "I don't want anything. I just wanted to get to know you. That's all I wanted." But he was braced for this, "What do you want?" kind of attitude. And then oftentimes laity see their roles as subordinates to or extensions of the pastor's role. There was a study done in the Methodist Church. 10,000 Methodist laymen were asked to identify with one of these four statements. The role of laity, laos, the people of God, the Greek word for the people of God. Which of these is true, according to what these Methodist laypersons said? The laos are members of the people of God called to total ministry of witness and service in the world. Secondly, those who are ministered to by the clergy who are the true church. The laos, thirdly, are people in part-time Christian service. Or fourthly, laos are non-ordained Christians whose function it is to help the clergy do the work of the church. Which do you think of these four do you think got the majority of the people's response as to what the laity is? The last one? Okay, how many of you think the last one? Non-ordained Christians whose function is to help the clergy do the church work of the church. Okay, some of you. Let's go back to the first one. How many of you think the majority were the first one? Members of the people of God called to total ministry of witness and service in the world. Not getting too many votes for that one, huh? That's the one we would hope they would vote for, but that's not the one they voted for. Laos are those who are ministered to by the clergy who are the true church. Okay? And then laos are people in part-time Christian service. Okay? Not all of you voted, So actually, I think about 40% chose the last one. Non-ordained Christians whose function is to help the clergy do the work of the church. That's what they viewed the laity to be. That's not biblically how we view it to be. I think we view it as the first one. Members of the people of God called to total ministry of witness and service in the world was what we would see that would be. So this is all to say that there is sort of an embedded mindset that comes with the dependency model ministry. Now, I may have over-caricatured it and been a little extreme in my description, but let's pause here. Does that seem somewhat accurate, unfortunately, in terms of what the dependency model of ministry is? Would any of you push back on that? Okay. So I'm going to assume passivity means acquiescence. So let's shift here. We're going to use a case study to shift, and you have this case study on the page 22 in your notes. Page 22. This will be a transitional case study from dependency model ministry to an equipping model of ministry. And let me just ask you to take a few moments to read that case study to yourself, and then I'll have some questions here on the screen for us to look at in this situation. So this is a very different picture of ministry than what we've been looking at. So, first question, how would you describe the role that Pastor Galloway played in this tragedy? Minimal? Minimal?
I think crucial. He passed on the ministry to the whole church.
Yeah, very. Okay, there's two ways to look at that. Yeah. In terms of the actual tragedy itself, a minimal role. But in terms of creating a ministering community where ministry was received from each other, he had a major role to play because he was the architect behind this ministry structure of the tender loving care groups that were there. Well said. What traditionally might we expect the pastor to do in a role like this in other settings? What might be expected of you if you were in a setting like this? Be the first one there. Okay. Take control over the whole situation. Make phone calls. Okay. Provide the comfort and counsel to the grieving family, certainly. Probably would have been a major role in an ongoing fashion, not just this one time, but multiple kinds of times afterwards, in terms of the being engaged there. Okay. With such a limited role, what struggles might this precipitate for a pastor? Pastor Galloway apparently walked out of there being quite thankful for the roles that the tender loving care people had. For those of us who maybe were schooled in the caretaker, caregiver role, we might say, what? What's for me to do? They've taken over the church. Horror of horrors. They're ministering to one another. Stop that. Yes.
He was pretty proud of the church because they stepped up to the plate and did what they needed to do as Christians.
Yes.
And that was a witness to other people that were probably there.
Absolutely. I'm sure it was. To see that kind of multiplication of ministry and the people taking hold of that and assuming responsibility like that certainly gave his heart warmth. The fourth question, what roles are played by the people in the tender loving care group? We heard 3 different roles mentioned, right? Somebody was standing at the door fending off the journalists. There was somebody on the phone making phone calls. What? Preparing meals or something like that. But also then offering comfort and counsel and spiritual tenderness to the family members that were there. Fifth, and this is maybe the most important question on the list. What was it that allowed the grieving couple to receive the help of the tender loving care group? Relationship. They were already involved in relationship with this group. These were simply their brothers and sisters in Christ that were there, who had been there all along. This was a community that was intact, and they were just ministering to one another. And so they didn't need the pastor to act in a particular role. They had already received ministry from one another and held that ministry in high regard. And that was sufficient. They didn't need something more necessary from the pastor. So is there anything in this situation that a pastor could have done better than the tender loving care group members? Doesn't appear to be, does there? No. So the role the pastor had was what? To equip the people by developing a structure where the people ministered to each other. And they had bought into that. That's wonderful. Okay, great picture, isn't it? Of what we would hope to have happen in our church ministries. Does that seem like a big gap, a huge miles away from reality in our church situations? Or does that seem like something that could possibly happen in our churches? Does this happen in house churches, Pradeep? This kind of ministry to each other. Is this more likely to happen in a smaller house church than it is in, say, a more structured church environment? Probably, I would think. Okay, let's shift the model of ministry here now and go on in our text, because Jethro has some advice to give to Moses. And so we read starting at verse 17. Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you're doing is not good. You and these people will come to you, will wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone." Verse 19. "Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. And you must be God's people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them the decrees and laws and show them the way to live and the duties that they are to perform. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times. Have them bring every difficult case to you." You're still there as the backstop. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied. Boy, doesn't that sound good? So what was the advice here that Jethro gave Moses? First of all, Moses changed your role. Secondly, Moses develop and share the leadership. Thirdly, decentralize the structure. Are the three things that I read in this particular text. So first of all, Moses changed your role. What role is Moses to have? Shift your role from being the answer man to being the teacher of the law and developer of leaders. So it was Moses' responsibility to get the teachings out to the people, especially to these other leaders, so that they can make the decisions on behalf of the people and they didn't have to do this themselves. So in a sense, decentralize your teaching as well as in your leadership structure that you're to have. One of my favorite books in ministry was written by Elton Trueblood. Elton Trueblood was a Quaker layman, was a man very much ahead of his time. He wrote a book called The Incendiary Fellowship. It's one of my cherished books in my library, where he talks about the pastor as player coach. The image for the pastor today should be as a coach, not the one who's the control of all things. And he says here about ministry, the ministry is for all who share in Christ's life. The pastorate is for those who possess the peculiar gift of being able to help other men and women practice any ministry to which they are called. And we visualized that earlier with this exposition of Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. Admittedly, there is not a whole lot of job descriptions specifically for pastors in the New Testament, right? You can't really go to any extensive place, so you have to kind of piece it together. But if there was one place that I would go to say, what's the role that leadership has within the life of the body, and there's leaders of apostles, prophets, and I would say pastors - teachers here, because I think pastors and teachers goes together in the New Testament role, is that they are to what? Equip the saints. Who are the saints? Who? The believers. Equip the saints. Who's then to do the ministry? The saints. Equip the saints to do the work of ministry. And if they're doing the work of ministry, then what will happen is the body of Christ will be built up. And it goes on actually to say, will attain to maturity, to unity of faith in the text. So as we said earlier, if we disrupt that process, then we're in trouble. So what do we mean by equip the saints? In my book, The New Reformation, or Now Unfinished Business, Returning the Ministry of the People of God, I do a word study on equip throughout Scripture and break the word down into three different parts. That the word equip means to mend and restore, It means to establish, lay foundations, and it means to prepare, train. So the word equip is used, for example, in Mark chapter 1, verse 19. When Jesus comes along the Sea of Galilee and he's getting ready to call James and John to be his disciples and call them away from their fishing business, what are they doing? They are mending their nets, right? And that's the word equip, is the word mend there. What good is a net if it's got a hole in it? So you mend the net, you plug the hole, and then that net can be used for what it's designed. That same is true with people. We've got holes in us. Or as I like to say, as Paul says, we're cracked pots. We leak. I told you my story earlier of fear and anxiety. God could not use me in nearly the way that he needed to unless I had some mending and restoring done in my life. I needed to get down to some of the root causes of what this anxiety was all about. I needed to admit it before others. I had to confess that and seek help. And there's all kinds of things that we could talk about in terms of the mend and restore ministry. But and for what we're talking about here, really relates to the bottom of the triangle. Establish and lay foundations. And that, one of the aspects of establishing lay foundations is discipling. Discipling people, giving them the foundations. When Jeff, if he's still here, there he is, gave his talk earlier, what was your first word that you used to describe this ministry? No, that was not your first word. Thank you. I remember it better than you do. Foundation. You're laying the foundation, and that's what we're trying to do, is build our life in Christ on a sure foundation. That's a part of the equipping and laying foundations ministry. We say that in different places here. Jesus Christ is the sure foundation, of course. There is no other foundation to be laid than Jesus Christ. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, it's Jesus that is that foundation. The Word of God is our foundation here, and we're preparing and we are modeling the way of Christ in our life. So what we're talking about in these few days we are together is this middle triangle. Prepare, train has to do with specific roles, so we want to give training for specific roles. So you have small group leaders in a church, they have a certain set of skills that you're trying to pass on to them so that they are prepared and trained to do that particular role, is what we're talking about there. Or finding someone's gifts in the context of call would be also an aspect of preparing and training. So all this is equipped for ministry, right? That's the focus of attention here. Contemporary image for the equipping pastor would be player coach, as I've already mentioned. Elton Trueblood says that the glory of the coach is that of being the discoverer, the developer, and the trainer of the powers of others. It is exactly what we mean when we use the biblical terminology about the equipping ministry. Now, when I use the term player coach, do you know what that means? Oftentimes, coaches are on the sidelines telling their players what to do, giving them guidance. A player coach is not just on the sidelines instructing the players. They are one of the players. They coach, but they put themselves in the game as well. So that's why I love to view a pastor as a player coach. I'm in there alongside my people, equally pulling the oar, trying to move the ship along. We're in this together. We're on the same mission. We're working shoulder to shoulder, side by side. I'm not elevated over somebody else, but we're together in this ministry because we have a mission beyond ourselves that we're trying to accomplish. The mission of the Great Commission, to bring it back into focus of where we are. We do this together. We have a common mission that we're in. I'm not elevated over you. I remember when I was first getting this understanding, and I became an associate pastor of a church in West Los Angeles, and my role was pastor of leadership development and discipleship. And I was new to the church, and I wrote my first newsletter article to the church congregation. I was trying to figure out how to sign off on this article. I was trying to describe my role, what I would be doing in the church, and so I sort of hastily signed it off, "Your coach, Greg." And what I was dumbfounded with was people's response to that. And I remember walking into the church that next Sunday morning after that newsletter article came up to me, and one woman came up to me and she said, "Let me see if I've got this. If you're the player coach, we're on the same team, right?" It's not two different teams, the pastoral team and the laity team. We're on the same team. Right, yes. And if you're the player coach, you're to help me find my role on the team and help me develop in that, right? Is that what I'm understanding? Right, you got it. And that's what we're to be about, to help the people of God discover what their role is. Well, we better, I guess, stop at this point. I see Jim waiting in the wings here. And we don't have a testimony now, do we? No, we just have a break. Okay. Okay, let me set up what we're doing at the 4 o'clock hour. I probably want to finish off a little bit of what I've done here because I'm just getting into this latter part, so we'll do that. But the 4 o'clock hour is kind of our catch-all hour, okay? So if you have specific questions, maybe on your pieces of paper that you have on your table there that you would like to ask, or you can just ask them from the floor, we'll spend some time doing that. We'll go back and do some reviews on takeaways from the day. So we'll get back to your takeaway list and try to build that if you haven't already been building it along the way. Probably be good to have that next to you at all times so that you're just maybe jotting something down in the moment that you want to make sure you remember. And so those three things. We'll finish off a little bit of this particular lesson, questions, and then finally takeaways in the last hour. Okay.